I've lived in Edinburgh for most of my adult life, and for much of that time, I've been writing stories about the murder investigations of my fictional detective, Inspector John Rebus. But the novels are about more than solving crimes. They're explorations of the city my detective inhabits. Edinburgh is often described as the Athens of the North, and rightly so. To my mind, it's one of the most beautiful places in the world. But D.I. Rebus views Edinburgh in quite a different light. To him, it's a crime scene waiting to happen. When I started out, I had no idea that my hero would be so successful and that he'd take up so much of my life, perhaps too much. Rebus is a strong character and his presence invades my home. To keep him at bay, I store a lot of my past manuscripts, notebooks and even copies of the books in my garage. I've not been through this stuff for years, but now I'm looking for inspiration. You see, I've given myself a problem, and I'm not sure I can see an escape hatch. 18 books in 20 years. 2 decades spent in one character's head, but there's an end coming. Rebus lives in real time. He was 40 when we first met him in Noughts and Crosses. He's now fast approaching 60. The cut-off point, the retirement date for all Scottish detective inspectors, no question. A parting of the ways is coming fast. Rebus is so much a part of my life that he's become my doppelganger. Each Rebus book takes me about 9 months to write. He takes up a lot of my time, and he's preventing me from pursuing other projects. Rebus has outstayed his welcome. When you live with a character for 20 years, they don't just inhabit you, they can start to consume you, like Hyde taking over the genteel Henry Jekyll. There are things I like about Rebus, but others I'm not quite so sure of. And I'm certain that if we ever met, he wouldn't have much time for me. He'd find me a wishy-washy liberal, suckled by the state from birth. But there's one thing I do hold over him, and that's the power of life and death. I'm thinking death. Another Edinburgh crime writer, Arthur Conan Doyle, grew tired of his detective. His nemesis Moriarty famously threw Sherlock Holmes over the Reichenbach Falls. I've thought of all sorts of ways to get rid of my detective, everything from quiet retirement to throwing him off this cliff. I'm going to end Rebus's career, but I'm not sure how it's going to work out. So for some inspiration, I'm going to return to some old haunts, look for loose ends, and revisit the people and incidents that helped me give birth to my detective. Back when I was a student, I walked everywhere, the only transport I could afford. I'm better off these days, but walking still appeals. It's hard to taste the city otherwise. The real mystery in the Rebus books isn't crime. It's Rebus himself coming to terms with Edinburgh. This is a city whose beauty conceals a divided and violent past. It's a city of ghosts. As the tourists explored the warren of charming closes in the old town, few realise that most of them have grim histories, usually involving a dead body or two. This is the World's End Close. This was the final close in Edinburgh. Beyond this was the Netherbow Gate, and beyond that, as far as the citizens of Edinburgh were concerned, was nothing of any consequence whatsoever. When I first arrived in Edinburgh in my late teens, the city's dark past seemed to haunt its present. The World's End pub is still remembered today as the place where two 17-year-old girls were last seen alive in the company of two unidentified men in October 1977.
On the evening of the 16th of October, Helen and Christine, two young girls, nice girls, were here in the World's End pub.
Just a normal night out?
Just a normal night out, good friends for years. And there were other of their group as well. And they had one or two drinks, as was the norm in these days. And eventually other friends drifted away, and Helen and Christine were seen by witnesses to be in conversation with two men, just round about here where we're sitting now. And the bottom line was they left the pub and disappeared literally off the face of the earth.
The papers were full of the World's End murders. Their naked bodies were later discovered 6 miles apart in East Lothian. Both had been beaten, raped and strangled, and had their hands tied behind their backs.
It really did stop Edinburgh in its tracks. Because of the nature of the victims, complete innocence, and because of the nature of their death, and because there was two of them. It was a shocking, shocking crime, and this sort of thing didn't happen here. It was the sort of thing you read about in newspapers from far-off, lawless cities.
Absolutely. I mean, it was because, you know, 'cause I was a student and I was much the same age as these girls had been.
Yeah.
And it just, you thought you were coming to a safe city. Your parents were suddenly worried about you. Suddenly Edinburgh seemed a more dangerous place than it might have been a year earlier. And, of course, that irony that the pub they were in was called the World's End. Sent a shiver up the spine.
That's right.
It really did.
The World's End murders prove one of the greatest challenges in modern Scottish criminal history. More than 500 suspects were identified and over 13,000 statements taken, but the case remained unsolved.
There are very few deliberate murders, cold, calculated murders in Scotland. Most of them are in the heat of the moment and therefore leave a big evidence trail. But there was nothing here from the start. But the fact is that when complete strangers come into a town and commit a crime like that and leave no trace, it's really, really difficult. And it still is. So try as we might, and with all the investigative skills we had, we got nowhere very fast, and it actually changed the social life and the cultural norms in Edinburgh and the nightlife for quite some time to come.
It was 20 years before there was any significant development. In 1997, using new technology, forensic scientists re-examined minute traces of evidence from the girls' clothing and isolated a DNA profile. With the backing of the new DNA sample, senior detectives reopened the case. It took them a further 9 years to arrest a suspect. The mystery surrounding the murder of the two girls haunts the city's police force to this day.
It was one of these tipping points. All is normal, all is safe, all is a little bit grey, all is a little bit boring, and all of a sudden you get an incident like this. And I think, look back over the history of Edinburgh, it's actually hallmarked by incidents like this that just show the reverse side of the coin. And that comes as a great shock when people feel so safe and complacent.
Moving to Edinburgh in 1978, I used to come up here and stare down at the city, trying to make sense of it. But then I realised the city was staring back at me. All those people down there, sitting secure under their roofs and under the mistaken impression that they were safe. What I realised back then was that the World's End murders revealed another side to Edinburgh, a dark and violent character that lurked just beneath the city's genteel surface. I wanted to write about Edinburgh's flip side. I just needed to find a fictional character to help me explore it.
Oh, I don't remember it being quite this posh. This was my room for a year when I was a postgraduate student, struggling at Edinburgh University to do a PhD on the novels of Muriel Spark, and struggling also to be a writer. I would sit here, there was a little chair in front of the gas fire, as close to it as I could get. No gas fire anymore, it must have central heating. No, it has got central heating. And write poems and short stories and pieces for magazines, all of which were rejected. And I was struggling, I really was. And then suddenly one cold March night, I was sitting by my desk, not as posh as this desk, in a chair not as posh as this chair, staring out, and I got the idea for a guy called John Rebus.
Rebus appeared almost fully formed from the outset. Little did I know that he would become one of the UK's best-known cops.
This is my diary that I found in the garage. And here we are, March 19th. It's happened, an idea for a novel, which started as one situation and has blossomed. Muse be thanked. I've not written any of it yet, but it's all there in my head from page 1 to circa page 250. That was the same day I signed the contract for my first novel, The Flood, so it was a pretty good day. Then a few days later, Sunday, March 24th, did 4 pages of my novel. It needs a working title. I'm going to give it Noughts and Crosses. So a few days in, I already had my plot and my title. That's not a bad week's work.
And over 2 decades later, I'm now contemplating Rebus's end rather than his beginning. For my first Rebus book, I decided to update Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde to 1980s Edinburgh. Noughts and Crosses is about a man from Rebus's past who was once like a brother, but now seeks revenge by abducting and killing children. He sends Rebus clues in the form of matchstick crosses and knotted pieces of string.
The killer bided his time working here in the children's section of the Central Library. What I didn't realise when I was researching the book was that police in Edinburgh were investigating a real-life case of child abduction, in the course of which I became a potential suspect in a murder inquiry.
Around the time I was writing my book, 2 girls, 5-year-old Caroline Hogg and 11-year-old Susan Maxwell, went missing. Lothian and Borders Police launched a massive hunt for the girls and their abductor. Completely unaware of the police investigation, I went down to my local station to see if the police might help me with some research. I particularly wanted to know how they went about catching a child killer. Big mistake.
Oh yeah, this looks awfully familiar. Their first question to me was, what is your book about? I told them it was about child abduction, not knowing that the police at Leith Police Station were investigating a child abduction in real life. And I came into their police station looking a bit shabby, a bit like a tramp. I had a growth of beard, bloodshot eyes, greasy hair, wearing clothes from a charity shop. They'd set it up quite nicely by saying to me, well, if you want to know how a police inquiry works, why don't we pretend that you're a suspect in an ongoing investigation? And I fell for it. Name, date of birth, address, occupation. And what were you doing on the night in question, Mr. Rankin? At that time, it was a missing persons case. It became a murder inquiry with several victims. And I was an early suspect.
Because the murders were so brutal and the victims so young, the hunt for the killer became a huge tabloid sensation.
It wasn't the most pleasant of experiences, as a result of which I didn't go near a police station for many years.
It took 15 years to catch the real killer. In 1994, Robert Black was convicted of the murders of Susan Maxwell, Caroline Hogg, and Sarah Harper. Rebus always liked to take journeys to escape the city, to think, reflect, to let off steam. One of the things to understand about Rebus is that he isn't actually from Edinburgh. He's an outsider looking in. I'm on my way to Rebus's hometown, Cardenden, across the Forth Rail Bridge, the umbilical cord that links Fife to Edinburgh.
The Kingdom of Fife, a county that's written a lot of history. A beggar's mantle, fringed with gold. That was how one Scottish king described the Kingdom of Fife. Some of that gold grows on the county's rich agricultural plain. There's gold below Fife's plains too, black gold.
Rebus was born into a Scotland reliant on traditional industries like coal. Across the Central Belt, most communities were in effect owned by the mining companies. They provided the miners with housing, electricity, medical care. They even constructed whole new towns alongside the pits, one of which was Cardenden. At school, Rebus learnt that Cardenden means den of witches.
The next stop is Cardenden.
Cardenden had grown up around coal, hurried streets constructed in the 20s and 30s to house the incoming miners. Rebus's family moved here because, like everyone else, his father was a miner. But suddenly, when Rebus was barely a teenager, the klaxon which signalled the shift changes at the pit stopped. As the coal industry collapsed in the 1960s, the sense of despair grew. If you've not worked it out already, this is my hometown as well as Rebus's. Rebus's past is inextricably linked to my own. We grew up in the same cul-de-sac, shared the same underage adventures, and even the same pets. This is Craigmead Terrace, where I was brought up. Before this, my family lived in, I think, 17th Street. The streets in Cardenden didn't have names, they had numbers because they were thrown up very quickly by the mining community that needed workers. I grew up here. I can't remember if I name it in the books, but you should take it as read that Rebus grew up in Craigmead Terrace, Cardenden. I remember every summer the smell of creosote when people were doing their fences and their doors. One of my favourite smells. Hiya, Anne. Ian Rankin.
Hello.
Is that all right if I come and have a
Yes.
look around? Is
Yes.
that fine?
Yes.
When I was a wee kid, this staircase always seemed incredibly steep to me. Of course, I would play it sliding down it, bumping all the way down it. And when I was very young, that was my sister's room, and this was my room. Yeah, it was tiny then, and it's tiny now. There's a hot water tank there. I'm not sure if that's now built in. Had a single bed here. Forget what was there. It was a little secret cupboard that would be the wardrobe, little secret cupboard. And I would do a lot of writing and hiding the bits of poetry and song lyrics and what have you underneath the mattress so my mum and dad wouldn't find them. And I had posters everywhere, posters of pop stars and favourite bits of writing from music magazines and things. I would cut them out and I would have almost like having a file of stuff but actually pinned to the wall so I could flick through it. And John Gregg and George Best. And I tried to make a wee world, a little self-enclosed world. But this whole cul-de-sac where we are just now, families all moved in at the same time, so it was very close-knit. Everybody knew everybody else. And I had family all around here. 2 doors away was one aunt and uncle. Over the back fence was another aunt and uncle. It was like living in the middle of a tribe. And that was fantastic in so many ways. It was such a safe place to grow up. But on the other hand, it could be quite restricting. You felt a little bit, you didn't want to be different from anybody else. You know what I'm hearing? I'm hearing birds. Under that towel, I think there are birds. Hello? Hello? This is St Ninian's Church. My sister Linda swears that when I was an infant, I wouldn't let my mum go past this spot so that I could have a conversation with him. He was my friend. He was my imaginary character. Even back then as an infant, I was having this other life where I was making stuff up and reimagining Cardenden as somewhere perhaps more exciting than it was in real life. The church played a big role in our lives. My sister and I would go to services, Sunday school picnics, scripture union meetings and so on. But there was another side to church life. There was a weird kind of apartheid that operated. Catholic and Protestant kids would never mix or play together. It was never really spoken about, but this odd kind of undercurrent dominated our lives. Some of these memories and experiences I gave to Rebus, but I didn't feel able to write about this aspect of my upbringing until I wrote Mortal Causes, which is about sectarianism. It was only when you saw them in groups like this that you caught a whiff of something else. Alone, they had nothing but a nagging complaint. Together, they had a voice. The sound of the lambeg, dense as a heartbeat, the insistent flutes, the march. They always fascinated Rebus. It was in his blood. He'd marched in his youth. He'd done a lot of things back then. Mortal Causes was not a popular book with some Protestant readers. In fact, one wrote to say I deserved to be blown up by an IRA bomb.
I could be pouring my heart out, still don't think you'd hear me. I could be crying my eyes out, still don't think you'd hold me. I've tried to shout you down, you just turn around, then you smile, then you're gone.
Fife plays a major role in several of Rebus's adventures and most of his memories. I wonder now if all this time I've really been trying to make sense of my own upbringing in order to understand myself. When I left Fife and moved to Edinburgh in the late 70s, it was only natural that I wanted to make sense of my new adopted home.
What city has a castle on a volcanic rock? A royal palace nestling under the crags. A lion-shaped mountain in the middle. A street a mile long with gardens and castle on one side and shops and restaurants on the other. What city other than the capital of Scotland? Edinburgh.
I used my fictional detective to explore this strange and complicated city. What Rebus discovered was a city ridden by division. This is a culture where extremes, old town, new town, rich and poor, preachers and prostitutes, were always clashing. So what were the roots of Edinburgh's split nature? Strangely, it began 500 years ago with the building of a wall.
This is a rare surviving section of the Flodden Wall. The wall was built in 1513 after a disastrous defeat at the hands of the English. Its main effect was to force everyone in Edinburgh to build within the city gates for fear of another attack. Space was at an absolute premium, and the only way to go was up.
The old town emerged slowly below the castle on its rugged rock, and by 1750, the population of 50,000 were huddled together within protective walls. Tenements rose, story upon story, to a height unique in these days among the cities of Europe. Rich and poor lived cheek by jowl. Ever-increasing congestion led to dreams of a new town. Bold and original conceptions turned dreams into reality and brought into being a suburb whose wide streets and gracious mansions contrasted vividly with the towering tenements of Auld Reekie.
This creation of a new town, built just outside the city walls, led to Edinburgh being described as two-faced. But the city's division goes much deeper than the separation of rich and poor. Bridges like the North Bridge, constructed to connect the old and new towns, helped create another of the city's famous characteristics.
Nothing is what it seems. This is South Bridge. Where's the bridge?
Sitting between the old and the new town was the Norloch. After it was drained, several bridges were built to connect the two towns. South Bridge was one of the longest, though its span was soon concealed by buildings on either side.
When South Bridge was constructed as part of the programme to join Old Town Edinburgh to the new, it boasted 19 arches, of which the one behind me is the only one still visible. The rest remain, but they're hidden, like the filling in a sandwich behind the tenement buildings which were constructed either side of them.
The arches are now known as the South Bridge Vaults, and within them lies one of Edinburgh's best-kept secrets.
Where are we headed for, Wynne?
We're now coming down 2 levels below the street, underneath the tenement.
There's a fine draft coming from somewhere as well.
Yes.
In a city tight for space, even the dark, dank voids between the arches were exploited by a variety of tradesmen, from cobblers to wine merchants.
So are we underneath the tenements or are we underneath the
We're
bridge?
underneath the tenements at the moment. It's along here that you find yourself underneath the South Bridge proper.
Hidden away from prying eyes, the South Bridge vaults attracted all sorts of illegal activities. Situated close to the medical college, it was both the perfect location and temperature for Edinburgh's body snatchers, the resurrectionists, to store stolen corpses, which were later sold to surgeons for research.
We believe that these vaults were used, for example, by the resurrectionists.
Storing them here until
yes,
they can
until
get
they
them
could
to
take them up the anatomy tunnel to the university.
And there was a tunnel that led actually up into the medical faculty.
That's right.
You could take
That's
bodies in
right.
that way with it. So it's almost, it seems to me, a sort of physical manifestation of these two Edinburghs. I mean, all these tunnels with these legal and illegal activities. You know, Edinburgh on the surface was a place of great science and learning and culture, but just underneath.
Yes, was supported by this underbelly.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
This literally is the underbelly, isn't it?
I think of the bridge supporting at street level in the open air those who were flourishing, moving out to new homes, to seats of learning on the one hand, and underneath the activities of the illegal and also accommodation for the poor.
Right. Well, shall we move a bit further in? Mm-hmm. Because it looks to me like there's more and more and more.
Although the vaults were abandoned decades ago, some of the previous occupants still linger.
Now, wee Jack is one of our ghosts. He's given to tugging at visitors' hands, as though he wants to play with them or hold their hand. But if he feels the presence of Mr. Boots, it's as though he's looking for reassurance.
Mr. Boots?
Mr. Boots. Because unlike Jack, Mr. Boots is not a friendly ghost.
I don't like the sound of Mr. Boots, I have to say.
Well, I think you've got due cause to be
dear.
concerned, Ian.
Is that where we're headed?
That's where we're heading. We think he was a landlord who oversaw the squatters who used these vaults as temporary homes. We think he may also have been a pimp, capitalising on the poor and the downtrodden women at that time.
I'm not a great believer in these things, but there is definitely an atmosphere down here. I mean, there's definitely an atmosphere.
Yes, yes.
You're very conscious, very aware of the histories of all the people who would have used these vaults for various different purposes. And also you're aware of being in this hidden Edinburgh.
Indeed.
This haunting image, taken by a tourist, is thought to be Mr. Boots himself. It's no wonder that Edinburgh's colourful past has produced so many great novels. I'm in a long line of Scottish writers like James Hogg, Robert Louis Stevenson and Muriel Spark who've written about this endlessly fascinating place. Teacher and spinster, Miss Jean Brodie exemplified the prim and proper side of Edinburgh. She defined it for a generation. But as a student, I noticed that hardly anyone had written about Edinburgh since Muriel Spark. It was as if the city had almost frozen in time. There was a flip side to this city, a darker side, and a policeman was just the kind of character to explore it. And there's no shortage of locations in which to set his adventures.
Stevenson called his birthplace not so much a small city as the largest of small towns. In the Rebus novels, I've described it as a city the size of a town that thinks like a village. Stevenson also said that Calton Hill was the best place to get a view of Edinburgh. I think he was right.
Perhaps the oddest of the structures on top of Calton Hill is the National Monument. It was designed to be a replica of the Parthenon in Athens as a memorial to those who had died in the Napoleonic Wars. Building began in 1822, but funds ran dry, and the celebrated Edinburgh architect William Playfair only lived to see a single facade of his building completed.
The city's grand ambitions came to naught. The structure, such as it was, became known as Edinburgh's shame. Still, it's proved a useful thing for tourists to clamber up and down. There's a lot of fun here on these oversized steps. It's got its fans, sure enough, and they have plans to finish it, but I doubt they'll ever get their way.
Next to the National Monument is an equally odd construction built in honour of Horatio Nelson. Karen Bootman was the caretaker here for 6 years, and during her tenancy, she observed that, like the city below, Calton Hill has a dark side.
It's lovely in the summer, it is. It's a lovely place to live in the summer. The winter's really cold, very cold, quiet in the winter. In the morning, my husband would go to work, kids would go to school, and then you would start getting the visitors in. The festival time's really busy, that's the busiest time. It's constant in the festival. And then just before 1 o'clock you have the time ball.
It was a 24-hour job, which meant Karen and her family were required to actually live in the monument.
You never really got much privacy. They would be peering in your windows. But to be fair, I don't think people realised that it was a house, that somebody lived there. They probably thought it was a museum or something.
Calton Hill is a place for tourists to enjoy panoramic views of the city. For Rebus, of course, it isn't a view at all. It's a crime scene waiting to happen. Because after the tourists leave, another kind of sightseer comes cruising.
Calton Hill's quite well known for gays. When I first came, I didn't know that. I mean, I must admit, I just thought people come, they liked the view.
In my second Rebus book, Hide and Seek, Rebus came to Calton Hill to question some rent boys about a murder. Hides was a fictional club where gentlemen could get their kicks with rent boys without the populace being any the wiser. I named some of the characters in the book after those in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
A year or two after Hide and Seek was published, there was a break-in at Police HQ in Edinburgh. Among the items rumoured to be stolen was a list of men's names, prominent men in Edinburgh society who had been allegedly consorting with rent boys. The timing couldn't have been better for Hide and Seek. Locals wanted to know, how did I get my inside knowledge? I didn't tell them, I just made it up.
Presenting Edinburgh's less than chocolate box side led to reviewers in the early days writing that it was unlikely my books would be recommended by the local tourist board. Now there's a successful walking tour of Rebus's Edinburgh, where tourists explore the locations from the books.
So here we are at the back of St Leonard's police station. Now if you look at the second set of windows from the right-hand side, the left-hand window has an extractor fan in it. That is the office of Detective Inspector John Rebus.
But Rebus liked to spend as little time as possible in his office at St Leonard's. This is St Bernard's Well on the Water of Leith, a much less well-known monument than the odd assortment to be found on Carlton Hill.
Legend has it that the spring here was discovered by St Bernard of Clairvaux in the 12th century. He was living in a cave nearby, took ill, drank some of the water from here and was restored to health. Down the centuries, St Bernard's Well became very popular with those who wanted to take the waters for health-giving purposes. Bibendo valebis means drink to be healthy.
Danube Street, in the heart of Stockbridge. There's no better modern manifestation of Edinburgh's dualistic attitude towards sex than number 17. Not so long ago, subject of a sex scandal.
On the surface, there was nothing to suggest that Dora Noyce was anything other than one of Edinburgh's more respectable, law-abiding citizens. She even put Tory posters in her windows at election time. Of course, visitors to her elegant townhouse knew otherwise, for number 17 Danube Street was Edinburgh's most celebrated knocking shop.
As students, we lived in the basement next door, and obviously in the hot summer, the inhabitants of next door would come outside to sunbathe, and I suppose, you know, at the age of 19 or whatever, it was unusual to see naked girls disporting themselves in the back green. An interesting education, I should say.
Dora can still claim legendary status as Scotland's most infamous madam, who used her comfortable home in the straight-laced heart of the new town as a magnet for pleasure-seeking clients.
There were 5 of us. We'd all had rather a lot to drink. We were all feeling rather frisky, and so we thought, right, we'll go to 17 Danube Street.
In summer and winter, she wore this fur coat and a sort of little fur hat on her head.
Oh, she said, are you off the ships? And I said, no, we're tourists. She said, oh, well, come away in, come away in. She said, I've got 22 girls. They work in fortnightly shifts, and they're nice, clean girls, nice, friendly girls.
She had very good manners, and of course always voted Conservative, and always had a Conservative sticker in her window, because obviously she believed in free enterprise. She ran the place like a business.
We were given glasses of wine, and various girls came around and chatted to us, and we were having a lovely time. And then one of our number said, oh, we want to stay together. Well, Dora, who was standing there at the time, said, oh, she said, orgies, we don't do orgies up here. She said, you'll have to go downstairs.
To me, as though she, somehow or other in her life, she had taken elocution lessons, though she certainly didn't have an Edinburgh accent.
I wished I'd known her better than the sort of 10 minutes I spent in her company. That's all I can say.
Dora was a favourite with taxi drivers. Her steady flow of customers rarely walked to Danube Street, preferring the anonymity offered by a black cab.
So how notorious was Dora Noyce in Edinburgh?
But I think everybody in Edinburgh was aware of Dora on 17 Danube Street. Maybe muttered behind curtains at night, but certainly everybody knew it was the best kept secret in Edinburgh. Apparently, when John F. Kennedy aircraft carrier was in at South Queensferry, the queue was right along Danube Street and round the corner into Dean Terrace, and the neighbours started complaining about all the Americans there. And it's reputed that she took over £4,000 before the ship's captain declared the street off limits.
We're coming up towards Deacon Brodie's, aren't
Yes.
we? This was one of our favourite haunts.
Well, you could almost say she was a regular here. After numerous appearances at the Sheriff Court, she would always tell the press to come over to Deacon Brodie's, and she would give a press conference. And that's where I met her. And she always ended with, make sure you get the correct name and address. She used the local papers as advertising.
I love the fact that this was Dora's favourite pub, named after Deacon Brodie, another Edinburgh character who lived a double life. By day, Brodie was a pillar of society, but by night, one of polite Edinburgh's most feared criminals. Despite numerous court appearances, Dora successfully presided over her business for 30 years, until her death, aged 76. Never short of an entertaining quip, she once claimed that her busiest time was during the 2 weeks of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. We have to thank the preacher and self-styled moral arbiter, John Knox, for Edinburgh's hypocrisy towards sex. Although he promised damnation to those who had sex outside marriage, the city has always been abundant in brothels. This is how Knox would want to be remembered, the fire and brimstone preacher with all of Edinburgh as his congregation. Here he's officiating at a funeral. I've looked at this stained glass many times, and it seems to me the mourners aren't just grieving, they're looking a little bit shamefaced, as though even back then the people of Edinburgh had something to hide. John Knox would have turned in his grave at the knowledge of brothels like Dora's, though given that he's buried in a tiny plot somewhere in this car park, turning might not be an option. An unadorned brown stone marks Knox's final resting place, parking lot 23. Some days he's a Rolls Royce, others a delivery van. The Edinburgh that Rebus patrols is like a maze, and treacherous with it. He sees the place as a series of connections. There's not much separation between the city of the dispossessed and the establishment. This area near the Old Town is called the Pubic Triangle, where city gents can come and slip into the lap-dancing emporia. This club has an interesting name. It's a reference to Edinburgh's infamous 19th century grave robbers, Burke and Hare, but also suggests that nearly 200 years later, Bodies are still for sale, though at least these ones are warm. It's not just the city streets that have inspired my stories. Arthur's Seat is the extinct volcano that lies in the heart of Edinburgh. A tale that has always haunted me is the mystery of the Arthur's Seat coffins. Back in 1836, 17 miniature coffins were discovered in a cave by some children. In the gruesomely named Book of the Damned, there's a description of this extraordinary find. In the coffins were miniature wooden figures. There were 2 tiers of 8 coffins each, and a third tier with 1 coffin. In the first tier, the coffins were quite decayed, and the wrappings had mouldered away. In the second tier, the effects of age had not advanced so far. What really intrigued me was that the coffins had been placed there over a period of time. So what was the reason? One day, a member of staff at the Museum of Scotland suggested I write a Rebus story about the Arthur's Seat coffins. I decided to go along to find out more. I went up to the 4th floor, and hidden away in a wing of the building, I found the little coffins containing the tiny dolls.
They were closed when the kids found them.
Yeah, that's right.
And inside, we've got small, what, wooden carved?
Possibly Scots pine, like the coffins themselves. The figures on the coffins were made by a different hand.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah.
What about this metalwork? Is that just a pattern, or is that part of what's holding the structure together?
Well, it's part of a pattern, it's part of decoration, and I think it's meant to represent coffin furniture, coffin plates that you get on quite high-status coffins.
There's a lot of effort gone into these.
Oh, yes, aye.
I mean, a huge amount of effort.
Yeah.
And you think, not done by a woodworker, done by some person who was used to using crafts materials or using a knife, or...
Certainly, I would say someone who's used to using a knife. I mean, there is a possibility that it may have been someone like a shoemaker, because some of the little metal fragments could have come from buckles and shoes.
One of the things I really like about them is the fact that they are open to interpretation, and sometimes when you come to a museum, you're getting facts, you're getting history, you're getting things that we know for certain, and suddenly the visitor who comes to the museum here in Edinburgh is being given a question.
Yeah, we've tried to interpret the evidence as best we can, but I think it's quite important that we do say that with some objects, and particularly objects like this, at the end of the day, all we can say is we don't know, it is a mystery, and let the public make up their own mind.
Since their discovery, the mystery of the Arthur's Seat coffins has spawned dozens of theories, but the biggest clue to their purpose is their number. In all, the maker hid 17 wooden figures in the cliffside cave. 17 tiny coffins found hidden in a cave on Arthur's Seat in 1836 by some kids out playing. What do they mean? What do they represent? One of my favourite theories concerns Burke and Hare. Burke and Hare were 2 enterprising grave robbers who opened a small boarding house in Edinburgh and began murdering some of their guests in order to supply the Royal College of Surgeons with fresh corpses for their anatomy classes. So what's the connection between Burke and Hare and the coffins? A friend of Burke's was a shoemaker, and scientists now believe that some of the metalwork that we see on those tiny coffins, very elaborate metalwork, might have been shoe buckles from the period. So suddenly we have a chief suspect, a shoemaker friend of Burke's. But why did he leave them there? Well, 17 coffins, 17 victims of the serial killers, Burke and Hare, his memorial to the dead. The shoemaker's memorial provided me with the perfect beginning for a Rebus mystery called The Falls. A student vanishes, and Rebus's only lead is a tiny carved wooden doll in a coffin found near the girl's home. When Rebus isn't out and about solving crimes, he comes here to his favourite pub. The Oxford Bar is a small and willfully clubby place not far from Princes Street. I started drinking here as a student, and by my third visit, the bar staff would pour my choice of beer unprompted. Crucially, I also discovered that among the clientele were a number of serving and retired police officers. Perfect. Some of my favourite descriptions in the books involve bars and the people who drink in them. Old men sat with their half-pint glasses, staring emptily towards the front door. Were they wondering what was outside, or were they just scared that whatever was out there would one day force its way in? A pub at its best is a place of safety, a retreat from the world. It offers sanctuary, comedy, space for reflection and the makings of a hangover. It's a place to meet people, or to be alone, a place of vivid conversation or silent reflection. Rebus liked the atmosphere here and the fact it sold quarter gills. Though Rebus has had a problem with drink from the word go, and he had good reason to drink, there were things in his past he needed to forget. And on that note, gentlemen, he had trouble sleeping when sober. He'd stare into the darkness, willing it to form shapes so that he might understand it better. He tried to make sense of his life, the early, disastrous army years, his failed marriage, his failings as a father, friend, lover, and would end up in tears. Drunk, his sleep was dreamless, or seemed that way on waking. The Scots relationship with alcohol extends to our language. We've got as many words for drunkenness as the Eskimos have for snow. We're trying to collect as many words as we can that mean drunkenness or being drunk or getting drunk.
Sozzled.
Stushed. Bluterd. Stooshed.
Reeking.
Jack and Rose.
Tuppers.
Legless. Inebriated.
Pished. Steaming. Trolley.
Bluterd.
Mashed. Wasted.
Guttered.
Foo.
Rebus's city comes alive at night. This is when Jekyll most conspicuously becomes Hyde. He walked up the bridges, stopped at some railings so he could look down on the Cowgate. There were clubs still open down there, teenagers spilling onto the road. The police had names for the Cowgate when it got like this: Little Saigon, the Blood Bank, Hell on Earth. Even the patrol cars went in twos. Whoops and yells, a couple of girls in short dresses. One lad was down on his knees in the road, begging to be noticed. There appears to be a self-destruct gene in the Scottish character. We know how to change our diet, know that smoking, binge drinking and the lack of exercise doom us to this early grave, yet we resist change. We're addicted to that which destroys us. Rebus sees alcohol, sugar and fat as the unholy trinity of the Scottish diet. What was it that made Scottish people reach for the comfort foods, the chocolate, chips and fizzy drinks? Was it the climate? Or could the answer lie deeper within the nation's character? Rebus and I share a lot of the same opinions and memories, but we're far from being the same person. To me, Edinburgh, with all its contradictions, is one of the most beautiful cities in the world. For Rebus, dealing with the city's dark side means he sees it as a series of crime scenes, always mistrustful of the people he meets. It's just as well we'll never run into one another. I don't think we'd get along. But I still face the same problem I started out with. I took the decision early on that John Rebus would live in real time. He would age between books. After all, if I wanted to write about the changing face of Edinburgh, it would be more realistic if my detective was allowed to change too. Now, Rebus faces retirement, and I must write his final case. So how am I going to get rid of him? And most importantly, where? I wonder if the drop from this bridge is high enough. Perhaps he has a fight on top of Salisbury Crags and falls to his death like Sherlock Holmes. The train station at Cardenden is a possibility. Or I guess the drink and the fags could get him in the end. At the time, inventing Rebus seemed so effortless, but killing him off isn't going to be so easy. He's a stubborn swine. He won't go willingly.
From Ian Rankin's best-selling books comes the TV adaptation of Rebus. Watch the new series now on BBC iPlayer.